Hello and welcome. At long last, we're looking at the Three Kingdoms of China. The Three Kingdoms period lasted from approximately 184 to, I believe it was 265. Now, technically, the Three Kingdoms didn't begin until 220, but in reality, most of the major players, at least a lot of them, were in place by about 184, and the Han had declined to such an extent that to pretend that it was still a meaningful political entity after 184 is a bit of a joke. I'm not going to do a deep history as we move into this, but I will give you some background. Perhaps I'll do some lecture videos in the future where we'll go through more of the deep background of the late Han to give you a better idea of what was happening and how the later Han dynasty found itself in this position. But for now, what I want to do is really jump in and look more deeply at what is happening in the Yellow Turban Rebellion. And to really get a good sense of that, what we're going to do is look at the major commanders from both the Yellow Turban side and the Han court side. This means that since we're looking at the senior commanders, you won't see a whole lot of familiar faces when we get to the tier list. And a lot of that is because I wanted to focus on the guys who were a big deal in the 180s. Most of them would be dead by about the mid-190s. None of them would go on to become particularly famous outside of their own time. Now, Cao Cao, Sun Jian, Liu Bei, those guys were all active in the 180s, but they were not the senior commanders. Those guys were only in their late 20s or early 30s. Most of the imperial generals we'll be looking at were guys who were 50 or older, guys who were at the height of their career at this time and serving in their most senior role that they would ever occupy. As for the Yellow Turbans, I actually don't know exactly how old most of those guys were because we don't have a ton of records on them, but we'll get to that soon enough. What I'd like to do first is point out that it looks like Tier Maker has screwed up again. The letters are darkened and the avatars won't move. So I'm going to try reloading this a few times to get it to where it's supposed to be. I don't have much faith that it will actually end up working though. When it doesn't want to work, it just simply doesn't. And that is part of what delayed my stream. The other thing is that when I was typing out my notes for this, I had one of those instances where if you're using a touchpad, sometimes you can accidentally hit the touchpad with your palm and then it will highlight and delete a whole bunch of shit at a keystroke within a split second. So I lost my entire entry for Zhu Jin, who's one of the major guys we're going to talk about. But as you can see here, we have some of the heavy hitters, starting here with Zhangjiao, the leader of the Yellow Turbans. Over here we have Hojin, the leader of the Imperial Han at the time. One person I did not include on this list was the Emperor Liang, but he is an important figure to remember. A lot of what goes on is his fault. He was completely inept. Now, to be fair to him, he was on the younger side, not very experienced, but that is still no excuse, really, because this guy was completely inept, and he played musical chairs with his commanders. He played a lot of court politics, relieved a lot of people for no real reason, and allowed a bunch of the abuses which really contributed to the Yellow Turban Rebellion. So, were he here, he would be our first F of the evening. But of course, right now we can't move anyone into position because Tier List Maker is doing what it does best, namely fucking up. So, what we'll do is I will try to pull up a map of China around the time of this rebellion. I don't want the Three Kingdoms map because the Three Kingdoms did not quite exist yet. They wouldn't for another 30 years or so. So as you can see, the Han Empire is not as big as modern China. Most of the expansion in China since this period was south of the Yangtze River, so down here. There was a ton of population growth down here in centuries later, and actually when we get to the Kingdom of Eastern Wu, we'll see that the Sun family was actually very important for the mass colonization of this area. So while this is the most populous part of China now, at this time it was a frontier. and there wasn't that much Yellow Turban activity down here. This is the Central Plains, where Beijing is now, and this is the traditional homeland of the Chinese people. It was here that the Yellow Turban Rebellion was strongest. In terms of the west, this will be where Liu Bei's kingdom will be located later. And here also you don't see a ton of activity. Jing province is right in here. This, by the way, is approximately where the Wuhan facility is, the famous Wuhan facility. So those areas will not play into this drama too much. Mostly what we'll be looking at are the centers at Guangyang. This will be where the biggest battle in the Yellow Turban Rebellion is fought. There will also be action at Yingchuan. I don't know where it's at on this map, but Wan, which I believe would be somewhere around here, maybe where Nanyang is pictured here, somewhere in this region, sort of in the very far north of Jing. Wan Castle also features pretty prominently here. Now, you see there are other regions that are affected, but we don't really have a ton of information about what happened there, partly because the big name players weren't involved. Now, onto the sources. So, what can we say about the major sources for the Three Kingdoms period? Well, we have a few histories, but all of those histories take up the perspective, the partisan perspective of Shu. Shu Han was the faction founded by Liu Bei, continued by Zhuge Liang, and although it would not prevail in the end, it has dominated the historiographical tradition. It's kind of like how, at a certain point after the Civil War, up until maybe the 50s or so, although the South lost the Civil War, the Southern perspective was in many ways dominant. Except in this case, Liu Bei is consistently portrayed as the good guy, and his enemies are consistently portrayed as the opposite. It was also portrayed in many ways as a two-way struggle, although it was called the Three Kingdoms, because there's this strong opposition which functions in a literary way between Liu Bei and Cao Cao. But the Sun family was also extremely important, and it's also worth noting that although these were the Three Kingdoms that gave the period its name, these were not necessarily the guys who were destined to come out on top. The kingdoms that could have formed under different rulers are many. And in fact, as we'll see as we go forward in the series, you can make a case that Yuan Shao had a much higher chance than any of the three guys who actually made it of founding a dynasty. He was much better positioned. He had a more prestigious family. He had an area that he controlled with a larger population and more wealth. He didn't make it, though. So as we move forward, we'll be examining why that was the case. And you'll notice that the face portraits I've chosen are from the Koei universe. There was quite a bit of evolution from the time of the 16-bit Koei games that Sean and I used for earlier tier list. These portraits are fairly lifelike, and they actually come from Romance of the Three Kingdoms 10, which came out on the PlayStation 2 around 2004 or 5. That's a game I've played the absolute shit out of, one of my all-time favorites. Of course, like many of you, I originally got interested in this period by playing Dynasty Warriors. And Dynasty Warriors 3 was my first introduction to this whole period of history. At one point when I was in college, I already knew early on I wanted to do history, and while I always leaned much more toward ancient history, there was a part of me that considered trying to do early China precisely because of my interest in this period. I didn't end up going that way largely because I happened to really get into Thucydides and things kind of went from there. But I think there might be a slightly alternative universe where actually my specialty is the Three Kingdoms or the Han or some related subject like that. Now, unfortunately, because this period is so hard to get into, I cannot claim to be an expert in it, merely an enthusiast. Another big obstacle to studying this period, there are a couple. One is that the sources can be pretty difficult to find in translation. And even for native Chinese speakers, the Chinese of this period is extremely difficult. So like any language, Chinese has changed drastically over time. And the people I know who can easily do modern Chinese absolutely struggle with anything from this period to the point that they don't even bother trying. And unfortunately, I have not had the good fortune of running into someone who's a specialist in this period. But one day, it will happen somehow or other. Any other preliminary remarks? Okay, so what I'll do before jumping directly into the list, I actually had some super chats left over from last Sunday's call-in show. So what I'll do is take care of those, so that way I don't forget. Because once we actually begin, it will just be a little bit of... I'll probably get a little carried away. There's a lot of detail to go through, so I don't want to get too deep before I have to pull myself out. Got a lot invested in the stream in many ways. This has been something I've been trying to get done for a long, long time. Okay, so from the 2/20/22 call-in show, Kirk Davis gave $2. Thank you, Kirk. And he said, Team Belisarius. Belisarius was a great general. Callum Hamilton gave £10. Thank you, Callum. And he did not leave a comment. But thank you anyway. Siabunga Minga Mazulu gave 140 of a currency called a ZAR. I looked that up, but I can't remember what it was. I want to say it was something I'd actually heard of, but I couldn't really quite recall exactly what it is. He says, Greetings, Thersites. I can't help but come to the conclusion that America is Rome and that its current period is very similar to the late Republic. I agree, and I think I've stated on many occasions that if we're looking for Roman parallels, the Republic is much more apposite than the Empire. The problem is I don't know exactly where we are on the late Republic timeline. My suspicion is that we're closer to the time of the Gracchi than the time of Caesar. But I don't know. And of course, all analogies are pretty loose anyway. Wyatt Daughters gave $9.99. Thank you, sir. He says, what is your opinion on the escalation of Ukraine? Last night we discussed that at great length, so I can't really say too much more today. I've not actually looked at the news today. I did get a text earlier from Michael, though, and apparently there are some Kremlin insiders already calling for Russia to snuggle up with China and accept a secondary role. Wyatt Daughters gave $19.99 again. Thank you, Wyatt. He says, Marcus Tullius Cicero is my political idol. What do you think about that? Well, I know a lot of people are into Cicero because he's a very eloquent writer. He definitely articulates his perspective extremely well. He's an important source for the period. I think that our sort of impression of his influence is a little overstated, though, because we get so much information from him. We don't actually know, for instance, how common a lot of his opinions are, politically speaking. And what's also funny to me is that we know, just by circumstantial evidence, that Pompey found him obnoxious and used him as a lawyer while also trying to ghost him socially. I think there's certainly a lot worse people than Cicero. I mean, Cato the Younger is not a very good political idol. And, I mean, Metellus Scipio, of course, is the bottom of the bottom barrel. But, I mean, Cicero's okay. He's okay. Cicero, though, as I've warned many people, if you went back in time to meet someone, he might not be the greatest choice because he did get on the nerves of most people around him. So he probably would be rather obnoxious if you actually met him in person. Just so you know. All right. Wyatt Daughters gave another one for $49.99. Thank you, sir. And he said, love your content. Definitely reinforced my love of history and expanded it. Well, thank you, sir. You're extremely welcome. That's what I try to do as much as possible. And then he gave one last one for $4.99. And he says, Russians seem to be welding anti-javelin cages on their tanks from the videos on Twitter. Good night. Thanks for the amazing content. Well, thank you, Wyatt. And I forgot to look up the anti-javelin defense. I don't know if that's an effective thing or not, honestly, so I can't really say too much about it. But, I mean, clearly the Ukrainians have found a way to knock out tanks, so apparently it isn't that effective. Okay. I'll just do this one now in case I miss it later, because you know how YouTube is now. Wayne G for $10. Yo Big T, which Chinese dynasty do you find the most fascinating? This includes the Yuan and the Qing. Okay, my favorite dynasty, I don't want to go with the Han because I feel like that's an obvious choice. The Tang, I don't know enough about to declare my favorite. I mean, I think they might have been the most powerful. I think I would probably go with the Sui dynasty right before the Tang, the guys who built the Grand Canal. I feel like they're a little underestimated, they're a little underappreciated, so I want to show them some respect. So I'm going to go with the Sui dynasty. Okay. So now we will jump over to our handy T list. Or, god damn it, I just called it a T list. What the hell's a T list? Tier list. Okay, so we have the pictures in place, but when it comes to where they actually go on the chart, we will all have to band together and do something that we had to do as children and use our imaginations, because tier maker, or excuse me, tier list, tier maker doesn't work at all. At least I've never gotten it to work. So yeah, we're going to have to be a little bit imaginative and hope for the best. So normally I print out my notes to make things a little easier. Tonight I'm going to have to dual yield laptops with my cat running around like a crazy person. So this could be fun in the ironic sense, who's to say. The first individual we will cover tonight is none other than the leader of the Yellow Turbans, Zhangjiao, also probably more commonly referred to as Zhangjiao. Now, he was, let me find the right place here, the leader of a movement known as the Way of Peace. The Way of Peace seems to have been a mostly Taoist movement, but one which was a little bit of a hodgepodge of various traditions that were popular in China, including the cult of the Yellow Emperor, who was one of the foundational heroes of Chinese civilization. So, Zhangjiao wandered China and sort of picked up bits and pieces of different traditions and then wielded it into his own belief system. He had two younger brothers, and together they created an immense following. The way that he was able to sell himself and his ideas was primarily because he flourished in the 170s, which was an extremely rough decade in China. Every other year there was a major plague somewhere in China, and this meant that there were people looking for answers and looking for healing. Well, one of Zhangjiao's specialties was faith healing. So he would travel to the afflicted, and of course, some of them would recover. And just for a larger historical context, the two diseases which most likely were breaking out at the time were smallpox and measles. And we know that smallpox was the Antonine Plague, as it was known in the West. And disease tends to travel across the world. This was the exact same time as the Antonine Plague, so most likely that was the culprit. So Zhangjiao developed a reputation as being something of a healer, and this earned him the respect of thousands and thousands of people. By the 180s, his movement had grown to the hundreds of thousands. And that's pretty significant because the Han Empire probably only had about 40 million or so people, if Rafe de Crespiny's estimate is correct. So this was a sort of borderline mainstream movement by the time the rebellion breaks out in 184. He also had some methods which involved using a kind of holy water that he had blessed, and he also would ask the afflicted to confess their sins. Now, of course, that sounds quite a bit like Christianity. I don't know if that's where he got the idea from, or whether it was some other religion that has a somewhat similar practice to it. I imagine, just based on geography, he probably had come into some contact with some of the religions of India, or perhaps even a few Zoroastrians. And as we've seen, he was a pretty eclectic guy, religiously speaking. So I would not be surprised if he borrowed those ideas from some foreign religion and then put them into practice in China. So, for the most part, this movement would develop most of its strength in the central provinces, the central plains, the heart of Chinese civilization. And if you look at where the rebellion was strongest, you can kind of see where he did the most recruiting. And this also might be a good indication of where the most plagues were, because he would always go to where the plagues were in order to spread his message. By about 180 or so, he had enough influence and enough followers he was actually able to organize his followers into 36 districts. And each district had, in theory, 10,000 people, although in practice it might have been more for some, a few more, less for others. We don't know exactly how many of these were able-bodied men of military age, but based on the rebellion that broke out later, probably quite a few. One of his predictions is that the era of the Han with its blue sky would end, and in the new era, the new color of the sky would be yellow. And he predicted that this would happen in 184. He made that prediction in 180. So his followers began to prepare for what they thought would be a new era. Now, on the surface, he preached this as a peaceful change, something that would be beyond the control of man. But in private, he is recruiting men to join in a revolt. The court begins to hear wind of this, and it's worth noting that the court is extremely dysfunctional at this time. So there are debates at court as to whether this was a peaceful movement or not. And actually the initial consensus was that Zhangjiao's movement was peaceful, and that actually, if anything, it would produce more peace in the empire. That people would be more concerned with what he's preaching than with rebellion. But ultimately, it becomes clear that the Yellow Turbans are planning something, and they begin to wear their distinctive yellow headbands to mark their readiness for the coming age of the yellow sky. The plan was for the revolt to launch in the spring of 184, but imperial officials got the jump on the Yellow Turbans when they caught wind of what was happening. In the imperial capital, one of Zhangjiao's chief followers actually went to the imperial officials and reported the plot to attack Luoyang. And so the emperor's brother-in-law, Hojin, sprang into action, arrested, and killed about 1,000 Yellow Turbans, and after that, Zhangjiao had to launch his revolt prematurely in February. Despite the premature launch, the Yellow Turbans did succeed in taking a number of places. For the most part, they didn't take that many cities, although you can see here that Yingchuan, Guangyang, Runan is fairly big. All these places, at least, were heavily threatened and invested, if not taken. So this means that this was a big deal, and it did put the imperial court on the back foot. However, had the rebellion gone undetected and then launched on schedule at full strength, it would have done much better. And this will then be joined by rebellions in Liang, which is approximately to the west of Chang'an. Somewhere in here. I don't think that movement was directly connected, however, so that will break out around 185. I don't know a lot of the details of the Liang revolt. Okay. So, the revolt is on. Zhang Jiao gathers his primary force up north. But once the army forms at Luoyang, they send one of their best generals, Zhu Jun, or no, not Zhu Jun, excuse me, that would be Zhu Ji? Well, we'll see in a second. We'll find it in the notes here. And like most of you, I am a bit unfamiliar with the Yellow Turban period because it is not too popular comparatively. Lu Ji. So Lu Ji will be equipped with an army that has some regulars in it. Most of the Han forces are no better organized than the Yellow Turbans. They'll be better equipped, and sometimes they'll have better officers, a lot of future all-stars from the Three Kingdoms era, but in terms of the quality of the men, it's not much different, except for pretty much this army. So this will be one of the better imperial armies. Lu Ji is a pretty senior man at court. We'll cover him in a bit. And he actually inflicts a quick defeat on Zhangjiao and invests him in the city. It would appear that, perhaps because he had visited too many plague zongs, Zhangjiao's health was pretty much compromised. And so, after this initial defeat, he pretty much falls ill and has to hand over command to his brother Zhang Liang, pictured here. We don't know exactly how long he managed to hang on to life after falling ill, but it would appear that he was alive for probably a couple months before he gave up the ghost. He was then buried in camp. Later, the city will be stormed by the imperial general Huang Fu Song, and Zhangjiao will be unceremoniously exhumed and then have his head cut off and sent to Emperor Ling at Luoyang. He's a little hard to judge as a commander. He only had one battle, and in that battle he was taken by off guard. We can kind of understand why he was off guard, because he assumed that because of the distance between the capital and where he was, that an imperial force would not come for him soon. He'd have time to organize this large army and then march down at his leisure. Of course, that doesn't happen. And so, yeah, it turns into a bit of a disaster. His brother will do much better in this command, but it's hard to say how well he would have done because he doesn't have enough good health left to try. In terms of as a military commander, I'd have to say that he is unrankable, but as a leader of a movement, clearly he has a lot of organizational ability. He has a ton of charisma, and he got men to turn out in droves. He also recruited a number of officers, many of whom actually were relatively capable. So I'm inclined to rate Zhangjiao as about a B. I think that he did have some actual talent. It just kind of fell apart because his rebellion was detected a little early, and also he fell ill right at the very beginning. That being said, had he lived longer, that is a pretty big what if for the Yellow Turban Rebellion, or if he had gone undetected. But the fact that he managed to get as far as he did, and that he kept secrecy as well as he did, given the massive size of his movement and his popular nature, that tells you a whole lot about how dysfunctional the Han government was and how incompetent Emperor Ling was. Okay. Let's see. I'll do a couple of these real fast because I can't really record them if I'm the only speaker. Usurpari Magnus, $5. Thank you, sir. He said, speaking of dynasty, people should know about Ming Dynasty where cannibalism was legal and widespread. It's horrifying reading those records. I've never heard of that. Thanks for that. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. Alright, Richard Chen, 75 NT. Thank you, sir. He says the Chinese from the later Han and after was quite readable to modern Chinese. The most famous calligraphers are from this period. That's not what I've heard, though. I've heard that it is an absolute chore for modern Chinese to try to read text from this period. Then again, I don't know Chinese personally. I'm basing this on people I know who study China, so I can't really say for certain. But yeah, calligraphy was pretty much taken to its peak in this period, and then later calligraphers are largely imitating the period of the Han. Calligraphy, by the way, was hugely valued. You could actually get promoted in the imperial bureaucracy just for having really nice calligraphy. And in fact, we'll see a couple of imperial officials today whose primary claim to office was scholarly achievement. So it would be the equivalent of going to someone who wrote a really well-received scholarly book and offering them a governorship or a generalship on the basis of, you wrote a really great book of poetry. Would you like to lead an army and put down a revolt? Kind of crazy to think about, but that's how the Chinese bureaucracy worked in the imperial era. Okay, so now we will move on to talk about the second of the Zhang brothers, Zhang Liang. And it's interesting because in the Koei universe, in the Three Kingdoms games, typically Zhang Bao is portrayed as the second in command and the second oldest of the brothers, but historically it was Zhang Liang. And I don't know if he was actually older than Zhang Bao, but he certainly was senior militarily. So we'll cover him first. I forgot to mention that when he opened the revolt, Zhangjiao gave himself the title of General of Heaven. So Zhang Liang took up the title Lord of Man, and Zhang Bao became Lord of Earth. So they were kind of trying to unite heaven, earth, and humanity. And I suppose it's because of his title, Lord of Man, that people presumed he was third in rank. Perhaps religiously he was, but in terms of military arrangements, he clearly was senior to his brother, Zhang Bao. So when Zhangjiao fell ill, he appointed Liang to take overall command, and Liang would continue in command after Zhangjiao died. In many ways, I guess you could say that he is sort of the main Yellow Turban general, since he is commanding the largest army for the longest period of time. His command will stretch for most of 184. So initially, he is besieged at Guangzhong by Lu Ji, the imperial general. We'll talk about what happens to Lu Ji, but after his initial success, he was slandered at court, he got recalled, and then his replacement was Dong Zhuo. Many of you know him from the Three Kingdoms games and from all the different media, including the show. Dong Zhuo was a senior commander, but not necessarily what we'd call a skilled commander. So Zhang Liang was able to defy him for months. Eventually, the court relieved Dong Zhuo and appointed Huang Fu Song, who had had some successes in the south. This would have occurred around September or so. I'm not sure whether by 9th month the record meant that it was September or that it was the 9th month of the campaign. At any rate, though, in the fall, Huang Fu Song arrived, took command. At first, he tried to test the defenses and he was repulsed, but then a month later, he successfully stormed the city. Zhang Liang was killed in action, and that was the end of his life. But it is worth noting that Zhang Liang was able to keep the army together for a considerable length of time. He defied Lu Ji after the initial defeat, and then he was able to defeat Dong Zhuo a couple times, and even got a victory over Huang Fu Song, who, in my opinion, is the best of the imperial generals from the 180s. So I would say that Zhang Liang is a solid B as a general. And we have to remember, too, he is leading an army that has not all that much in the way of equipment or officers or organization. It has high morale in numbers, but that's about it. And some of the men they're facing are actual professionals. So the fact that Zhang Liang was able to get as much out of them as he did is a testament to his skill. So he's not only a B, but probably a pretty high B. If I had to elevate either him or his older brother to A status, I would actually go with Zhang Liang. And it's not clear if he ever revealed that his brother was dead to the men. So that's another mystery that, unfortunately, we don't know the answer to. After Zhang Liang died, his other brother, Zhang Bao, managed to break out and strike away. So he struck out north in order to try to escape and reorganize the survivors. As I mentioned earlier, although in the Koei universe he's often portrayed as being the second in command, he's actually the third. So he only takes over once Zhang Liang is dead. He did manage to escape with a number of men. However, the district he marched into already had an imperial army there waiting. So that army was able to delay Zhang Bao until Huang Fu Song could catch up. And Zhang Bao, despite having the ability to keep together the survivors, was not able to fend off this pursuit. He and his men were horribly butchered. And we'll talk about what happened afterwards, because that's more of a Huang Fu Song story. But suffice to say for now, though, that Zhang Bao almost found himself part of what Sean likes to call a skull pyramid, because the Imperials killed so many Yellow Turbans in the battle that they considered building a skull pyramid for fun. That also shows you exactly how little regard the Han court had for the Yellow Turbans. They saw them as absolute rabble, and they treated them as subhumans. Not all that many Yellow Turbans were taken prisoner, from what I understand. I think Cao Cao formed an elite unit out of some captured Turbans, but other than him, almost all the other Han saw the Yellow Turbans as subhuman scum and butchered them whenever they caught them. In terms of Zhang Bao's rating, I would rank him a C, because clearly he had the ability to keep men together. I can't be too much harsher than that, however, because he had nowhere to go, his men were routed. He put up a stiff fight, but he was in an impossible position and bound to lose. And I don't really count defeat against a lot of the Yellow Turbans, because, as I mentioned, they are out-equipped. Some of the enemy armies facing them actually have pros in them, and a lot of the officers in the Imperial ranks will prove in time to be very, very good. Cao Cao is already an accomplished subordinate, as is Sun Jian, and as most of you are aware, those guys would turn out to be extremely good generals in the future. And by this point, they're already about 30 years old, so they probably have a lot of that already. Okay, so moving on from the Zhang brothers, we now arrive at Xiaohong, one of the other Yellow Turban generals. He's actually fairly senior. And one thing that does work in his favor in terms of his rating is that, unlike many of these guys, he actually will make it to the end of 184 with some troops. A lot of the guys we're about to discuss after him will die very early and in horrible ways. Xiaohong, we don't know a lot of details about him because his command seems to have been in the east, so most likely he was somewhere over here rather than on the main front. And because our sources are heavily biased toward the future heroes of the Three Kingdoms, well, guess what? Xiaohong didn't face any of those guys, so his coverage is limited. After Zhangjiao died and his army was defeated under Zhang Liang, 4 of the Yellow Turban generals declared themselves the Avengers of Zhangjiao, and Xiaohong was one of them. He was in command at Wan Castle, which would then go on to be the last major stronghold of Yellow Turbans, late in 184. One of his subordinates was a fellow Avenger, Han Zhong. As the enemy army under Zhu Jin closed in, Han Zhong lost his outpost to Zhu Jin's forces. And actually the guy who, one of the guys in Zhu Jin's army at this time was none other than Sun Jian, who distinguished himself. Xiaohong seems to have kept his army outside of Wan Castle in order to relieve it from the Imperials. And as he was marching to his subordinate's relief, he encountered Sun Jian, who was keeping watch while Zhu Jin oversaw the investment. So Xiaohong's thought was, if I take out Sun Jian, then that will open up the siege and I will win. So he seems to have challenged Sun Jian to one-on-one combat. And although Sun Jian killed him in one stroke, it does appear that Xiaohong was able to take out Sun Jian's horse. Because one of the accounts, and this might be fiction. Another thing to mention is that the Romance of the Three Kingdoms novel is a work of fiction and makes up a lot of stuff. So I don't know whether this detail comes from fiction or not. It kind of sounds like it does. But after they rode past each other and swung, Sun Jian felt his horse dying, so he pulled Xiaohong's corpse out of the saddle and jumped on his horse and then rode it for the rest of the battle. Xiaohong, as I said, lasted a long time, and that does show he had some skill. He was not a scrub. I would give him a solid B. He did pretty well given the circumstances. He was also isolated by himself, and Zhu Jin was no slouch. He was a pretty respectable commander. And of course, Sun Jian was known for his personal prowess, so the fact that this guy was able to kill his horse means that he was a decent enough warrior. And the fact that he felt he could take on Sun Jian also implies that, he's decently strong. Next up is another Yellow Turban general, Zhang Man Manchang. He is not a relative of the Zhang brothers. He just happens to share their name. It's an extraordinarily common name. He was a bandit leader, but then he was recruited by Zhangjiao and converted to the Way of Peace. Later on, he was invested with major command responsibilities. Early on in the revolt, he managed to defeat the imperial general Chu Gong in personal combat. That gained him a certain amount of prestige. At the decisive battle of Julu, he commanded the flame statues and then secured the flanks against Sun Jian and Cao Cao for a little bit. But ultimately, he lost control of the forts and the line broke. He then was killed in action at the hands of the guy on the Han side who actually had the most personal kills. We'll talk about him. His name is Chen Jui. You've never heard of him, and I hadn't either until I read up for this battle. For this list, I mean. Chen Jui is a forgotten man in this revolt, but someone who was considered a beast in 184. So, Zhang Manchon is dead. To me, he seems extraordinarily average. It's hard to really rate him. There's not much to go on. I would put him as a C. I prefer to rate them if at all possible, so... And based on what little I can tell, he's about a C. But now we'll get to a few guys who can't really be ranked because there just isn't enough. The first of them is Han Zhong. We mentioned him as one of the major subordinates of... This is Han Zhong. One of the major subordinates of Xiaohong above. He was a bandit as well. He joined up with the Yellow Turbans and then became a commander. He seems to have risen through the ranks more so than Zhang Manchang, who was an actual bandit leader. So he must have gotten in good with the Zhang brothers. And it would appear that Han Zhong might have been a recipient of a Zhangjiao miracle at one point earlier in his life, and that might be where he joined the movement. He became one of the Avengers of Zhangjiao, and he, of course, joined up as a subordinate with Xiaohong at Wan Castle. There he was the commander of the garrison. He had his outpost driven in by the main force. And after the death of his commander, he tried to break out or was defending against an assault when he, too, was killed by Chen Ji, who killed him with an arrow. And once he dies, the city falls, and the Yellow Turbans at Wan are massacred. Based on what little I've read here, there's not really much basis for a rating. He seems like a C or a D if I had to just pull a rating out, but for the most part, I would say he's a U. There's really just not that much to go on. And he was a subordinate for most of this time, so kind of hard to judge. Um, Alright, let me check something real fast. What did I miss? Here we go. No, I already got that. Where did I? Yeah, Richard Chen. Okay, I did miss that. He said, thank you, Richard. He said, the Yellow Turbans need to be understood in the context of the transformation of society during the Han from its start to this period. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on with the Yellow Turbans. Zhang Jiao draws on a whole lot of tradition, and that previous decade really caused people to start to question whether the Han still had the mandate of heaven or not. All the plagues and rebellions and everything else made it look like the Han had lost heaven's favor. And yes, as you mentioned here, most of these guys were clearly not aristocrats. Otherwise, they would have been not bandits, first of all. So that kind of goes without saying. The sources make it pretty clear, though, that all of the respectable men of the propertied classes were firmly with the court. That being said, it's also possible some of these guys actually were aristocrats, but it became a source of embarrassment, and as a way to smear them posthumously, they were portrayed as bandits. Hard to say. But of course we'd never know, and that's just pure speculation. So, okay. Next up we have Bokai. Or no, excuse me, Sun Zhong first. Sun Zhong is pictured here with the spear. So right here. Sun Zhong is someone I always mix up with Han Zhong, and not just because they happen to have the same personal name. They kind of have a very similar story, and both of them die pretty early before they have a chance to prove themselves. Or at least pretty, not necessarily early, but they die in personal combat without having really displayed any distinctive command qualities. So Sun Zhong had been a bandit leader. He joined the Yellow Turbans. I think you can see a pattern of where a lot of these leaders came from. And he actually gets into the Romance of the Three Kingdoms much more than a lot of these other guys because he faces, I'll let you guess, it's Liu Bei, the hero of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. And Liu Bei at this time was leading some volunteer troops under the command of Gongsun Zan, who was a more senior officer. And during the combat between Liu Bei and Sun Zong, Liu Bei managed to kill him with an arrow. And by the way, to the best of my knowledge, that is the only time that Liu Bei is attested as a killer of another officer throughout his career. I might be wrong about that, but I think that Sun Zhong has the distinction of being the only enemy officer killed by Liu Bei with his own hands. And his other distinction, I guess, is that he was still alive after the fall of the main army under Zhang Liang. He joined up as one of the Avengers of Zhangjiao, but he did not gain much vengeance before Liu Bei put him in an early grave. To me, Han Zhong is a U. You cannot really rank him based on what happened. Next up, we have another major general of the Yellow Turbans, Bokai. I always remember Bokai because he has a fairly distinctive beard, at least in his Romance of the Three Kingdoms portrait, and also he has a distinctive name. But he doesn't really do that much that we know of. He led one of the larger contingents of the army, and he actually managed to inflict one notable defeat on Zhu Jin. That in itself is pretty impressive. Zhu Jin was no slouch. However, later on, Huang Fu Song and Cao Cao arrived with reinforcements, and Bokai was overwhelmed and died in action. I would say Bokai is a B or a C. He does alright, but ultimately he does let himself be outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. Again, though, he is working with a force that doesn't have a lot of junior officers. There's not a lot of cohesion. His options are pretty limited, and the fact that he managed to get one over on Zhu Jin is fairly impressive, even if things did not work out in the end. Next up, we have another officer who is so minor that Koei did not make a face portrait for him, at least not in the ROTK 10 time period. I'll have to check up on more recent games for future entries for some of these more minor figures. But this man is Zhangjia. He also is an Avenger of Zhangjiao. That's the only reason I put him on this list. Otherwise, I probably would have excluded him. But I figured I already have 3 out of the 4, so why not complete the collection? Now, he's one of the more minor Yellow Turban generals. After Han Jong is defeated, he's now thrust into command of the remaining and almost certainly disintegrating Yellow Turban army at Wan Castle. Zhu Jin continues to besiege him there, and he managed to hold out for a little while, but when Zhu Jin launched a full-on assault, he died in the fighting along with his men. I will give Zhangjia a C out of respect, because he did manage to fight to the death and keep his command together, and that's commendable, but of course futile. Next up, we move to the other blank profile. This one is occupied by a commander of the Yellow Turbans named Ma Yuanyi. He is someone whose fate is not altogether clear. And what I mean by that is that there are 2 different versions of what happened to him. What is clear, though, is that he was in tight with the Zhang brothers, and he was scheduled to be one of their major commanders. So his command responsibility stretched from Jing to the Yang province, where he would command one of the major armies in the south. And he also made frequent visits to Luoyang to organize the revolt at the imperial capital. And while there, he did recruit a number of men, both to the way of peace and to the revolt. But one of the people he recruited reported him and reported the revolt. And now the controversy comes in. We know that Hojin launched an investigation and arrested a lot of people, and then imprisoned or executed 1,000 or more men. The question is whether he was among them or not. So, according to one account, Ma Yuanyi was captured by the imperial forces, and then he was quartered using a chariot. And by quartered, I mean that each of his limbs was tied by a rope to a different chariot. The chariots drove in 4 different directions and pulled him apart. Again, the Han court did not think very highly of the Yellow Turbans, if that were not already clear. However, in another tradition, he did not die. And I believe, actually, maybe it's historically he was killed in the capital, and the Romance of the Three Kingdoms novel he lives on. I think that's how it worked, but don't quote me on that. So, in the other tradition, he lived to fight another day. He fled to Zhang Jiao's main force, and he became one of the major officers at the Battle of Julu. He was defeated by the eastern forces under Cao Cao, and probably then executed after the battle. The source doesn't really say what happens, but most of the Yellow Turbans were killed after the fact. And if you're noticing some ambiguities here, a lot of that does boil down to the fact that even by the standards of the Three Kingdoms period, the accounts of the Yellow Turban Rebellion are sketchy. So before we transition to the Imperials, let me make sure everything's still running, sound, everything else. Yeah, so we're still good. Alright. Also, anyone who knows of any other examples of quartering, let me know. Especially from this period. Because I have not read of any other accounts of quartering in the Three Kingdoms, so that might give us some indication of how legit that tradition is. Okay. Now we move to the Han court. And we come upon, I would say, easily the most controversial figure out of the people we're discussing today, Hojin. Typically speaking, Hojin is regarded as a complete moron. The sources, which are written by aristocrats, look down their noses at him. He owed his position to nepotism. So how did he get to the position he was in as General-in-Chief of the Han during the Yellow Turban Rebellion? Well, it's pretty simple. His sister became the empress. She rose from being part of the harem to being the empress, and with that, her older half-brother, Hojin, was massively elevated in power. That being said, despite the fact that Hojin is portrayed very negatively, if I just look at his career and look at the facts, I don't see much evidence that the man was incompetent. Now, I don't see any signs of brilliance either, but I do think that class prejudice has created a portrait of him which is unfair. So, let me explain why this is the case. So, Hojin's family was supposedly a family that practiced the business of butchery. And it's worth noting, for those of you who are big fans of this period, that another famous figure also came from a family of butchers, and that would, of course, be Zhang Fei, Liu Bei's sworn brother and one of his best generals. So, because of his low status growing up, most likely he did have some defects in his education. If you don't start early, it's hard to catch up as an adult. That being said, once his sister enters the harem and gains favor with Liang in the 170s, I find it very, very hard to believe that Hojin was given no instruction. So I think that he must have received some education as an adult in order to meet with his new rank, because once Liang elevates his sister, he begins to take an interest in Hojin's career. And partly that's because he knows Hojin will owe his position to him, and so he will be loyal. Hojin will rise at court by the 170s. He will be a gentleman cadet, and also serve as general of the household rapid as a tiger. And later on, he will actually be administrator at Yingchuan. We talked about Yingchuan earlier. It's right here near the capital. Before the rebellion broke out, Hojin actually has a turn governing it. So that means that even before 180, when he really comes to power, Hojin actually already has experience in both military and civilian offices. Now, again, he's not a professional bureaucrat, but he's not completely without experience when he becomes general-in-chief. He wasn't literally just a butcher fresh out of his shop who took off his apron, donned a suit of armor, and took command. He had probably a little under a decade of experience at a high level before that. This is not an ideal preparation, but it is a lot more than is sometimes thought. In 180, Liang officially chose Lady Ho to be his official empress, and so Hojin became an important man at court, and his rank was elevated even more. Now, as we've mentioned, Liang is pretty incompetent. He's a palace emperor. He doesn't really venture forth too much. He's very dependent on his advisors, and he likes to play balance of power politics between his officials and his court eunuchs. And because Hojin is trustworthy, he gets quite a bit of power. He becomes palace attendant, which is a fairly senior position. He also becomes court architect, which I'm not sure exactly what that is. I assume he's not designing buildings, though. And he also becomes the intendant of Hainan, which is a pretty senior position. When the rebellion breaks out, not only is he named commander-in-chief of the Han forces, but he also is the guy who heads the investigation which found out Ma Yuanyi and the rebels at Luoyang. So again, when he's appointed commander-in-chief, it's not because he's the best soldier in China, but rather because he's the soldier that the emperor can trust the most. And if we're being completely honest about it, it does not take a military genius to put down a peasant uprising. Now, a complete moron can fuck it up, but you don't have to be a genius to win with a superior force. And Hojin's role was largely supervisory. He did not command in all that many battles. Most of his subordinates were professionals, men such as Huang Fu Song, Lu Ji, Zhu Jin, and Zhangjiao. We'll get into more of the details of the fighting when we look at those generals, though, since Hojin doesn't really do all that much. He does move around with his army some. He sends reinforcements. He controls the reserve of professionals. And for the most part, he does appoint commanders who get the job done. The emperor interferes some and makes things harder, but Hojin, to his credit, does resolve the problem by the end of 184, more or less. While that year was progressing, he did use his newfound influence to convince the Emperor Ling to appoint more members of the Ho family to power. And he also got the imperial courtier Wang Yoon freed after he had been imprisoned after being accused by a number of eunuchs. And that might be at the heart of the famous feud between Hojin and the eunuchs, because basically all the officials we're going to talk about had a very strong bias against the eunuchs, and the feeling was mutual. Unlike in, say, Rome or Byzantium, where usually the generals were the aggressors pretty consistently, at this period of Han history, it's pretty tit for tat, where the generals and the court eunuchs are constantly at one another's throats and constantly plotting against one another. When you have a weak emperor like Ling, it makes things so much worse. So, Hojin is fairly prestigious at this time. He does not go west yet. By 188, the war is over, and also Liang has been settled. And Hojin's standing is pretty high. Most people actually respect him by this point, because he has done his job. So Ling becomes a little jealous of his brother-in-law, and so he decides to elevate one of his eunuchs to a high position of authority, which is over Hojin. So he chooses the eunuch Jian Shi and makes him Hojin's commander. Jian Shi then attempted to send Hojin to the west to command in Liang, where things have been going poorly under mostly Zhangjiao, who we'll cover in a future video. But Hojin was able to basically drag his feet and delay his deployment. And while he was delaying, most likely he delayed because he knew that the emperor was ill, Emperor Ling died, and this led to the elevation of Hojin's nephew, Emperor Xiao. There was a succession struggle at this time. So Hojin and his half-sister, the Empress Dowager, managed to eliminate Ling's mother and also Ling's brother. And that gave them firm control over the court, but they still had to contend with the eunuchs, including, of course, Jian Shi. It should come as no surprise that Jian Shi tried to strike first, but Hojin survived the attempt and had him executed instead. Now, there was an uneasy peace at court between Hojin, who's part of the Regency Council, and the eunuchs. A lot of the men around Hojin, including famously Yuan Shao, and actually, by the way, it's worth mentioning Yuan Shao, who was an arch-aristocrat, does seem to have at least put forward a respectful face when dealing with Hojin. So Hojin did manage to win a fair amount of prestige over time. He urged Hojin to strike immediately and kill the eunuchs, but Hojin wanted to wait. He wasn't quite certain. And so he decided, against the advice of one of his key advisors, who we'll get to later, that the best course of action was to summon Dongzhuo's army from the west to strengthen his hand and hopefully intimidate the eunuchs. But the eunuchs heard a different version of the story, namely that Hojin was planning to kill them immediately, and so they decided to strike first out of self-preservation. So they sent a false message in the name of the Empress, and thinking it was just his half-sister wanting to meet with him again to confer, as they so often did, Hojin traveled to court without a military escort, and then the eunuchs fell on him. He died, and this led to quite a bit of bloodshed. Famously, of course, Yuan Shao will lead some troops into the eunuchs' chamber and kill them all, and shortly thereafter, Dongzhuo will arrive. He will use his official summons as an excuse to take over, And then, of course, this will lead to a civil war between Zhangjiao and many of the senior commanders. So, Hojin's death, of course, is very impactful. Had he lived longer, Zhangjiao would not have taken over, and also the Emperor Xiao would not have been deposed for his younger brother Jian. So, I find that in general the portrayal of Hojin in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms novel is unfair, and that he's not nearly as inept as he's portrayed. Again, he's no kind of genius, but he did not have the necessary prep work to become that. While he did fall to intrigue, he actually did fairly well against it up until the point when they tricked him into coming to the palace. He had held the eunuchs at bay, and he had recovered his position after being taken down a peg by his brother-in-law. So I have to give Hojin a C overall. Competent, but nothing special. And I guess that would constitute a hot take, technically, because I guess the consensus position is that he's a complete and total waste of space. But I disagree. I don't think the evidence bears that out. Let me get a drink real fast. Okay. Now on to one of the best commanders of this period. I would say the best commander, at least in my opinion, and that is Huang Fu Song. Huang Fu Song has an interesting background. His uncle was named Huang Fu Gui. He was actually from the Qiang people, who were a nomadic people around Chang'an who were not Chinese. And Huang Fu Gui entered service in the early 2nd century and quickly rose to become the greatest Han commander of his generation. So he really set his family up for future success. But it's worth noting that Huang Fu Song had some foreign blood. Huang Fu Song's father, Huang Fu Ji, used his younger brother's fame in order to become an administrator. He lived fairly quietly and died in the year 165. As for Huang Fu Song, he distinguished himself from a young age in both scholarship and in his military endeavors, and it's clear that he was very much more the successor of his uncle than of his father, as he dreamt of leading large armies and trained himself accordingly. When his father died in 165, he seems to have taken several years off from his official duties. I don't think that was terribly common, and most likely it was because he had some sort of a falling out with someone at court. Perhaps he was afraid of palace intrigue, or else he did not consider the Emperor Huan, who was Ling's predecessor, to be worthy of his service, something along those lines. But at any rate, he was absent from the court for over a decade, until the Emperor Ling offered him a position as consultant. So he took up that position, and at this point, he's probably over 50 years old. He is an older gentleman, and it was his generation that would be in the driver's seat for the most part at the Han court during the 180s. We'll see that men like Huang Fu Song have a huge influence on the development of younger officers such as Cao Cao. When the rebellion started, he managed to persuade the emperor to end a proscription against one of the political factions, lest the Yellow Turbans would be able to recruit a bunch of educated men who could possibly start to win over more educated men and really grow and expand the movement. It's worth noting that the court's assumption is that this movement will not be successful without gentlemen in it. I think if the Yellow Turbans had struck hard enough, they might have been able to win, even without the presence of any Confucian scholars, but the court's assumption in this case is fairly interesting. His argument was well accepted, and actually the emperor decided to end the proscription, and so they stopped hunting down men from that faction that had been condemned back in the 170s. I can't remember the name of that faction, by the way, but there was some court faction that had basically been banished. Huang Fu Song was then elevated to be general of the household on the left when the rebellion broke out. And this would have made him originally somewhere around the third or fourth in the hierarchy. Hojin is at the top. Lu Ji was probably senior to Wang Fu Song. Zhu Jin might have, not Zhu Jin, but Zhu Jin would have been equal. So yeah, he's about third or fourth in the hierarchy once the war begins. And again, while he did have some youthful exploits, he had been out of command for quite a while. So it goes once again to show that when Ling was searching for commanders, he was mostly looking for men he could rely upon, not guys who were the absolute most beastly generals around, necessarily. So, Huang Fu Song has about 20,000 men early on, and he more or less is sharing command with Zhu Jun, who also has 20,000 men, but they seem to have been ordered to cooperate very closely. I don't know why they just didn't appoint one man the commander and the other man the chief of staff or assistant, but anyway, I gotta be honest, I don't know exactly how Han armies were organized. It seems like there's a lot of flexibility, and that the court would issue different orders in terms of how armies would be organized. They didn't really have a set command structure like the Roman legion or anything like that, so there's quite a bit of flexibility. One thing that the two armies that Huang Fu and Zhu Jun did not have, were a lot of professionals. So neither of these two armies operating at Yingxuan will have much in the way of professional soldiers. Initially, Huang Fu Song is attacked by a superior force of Yellow Turbans, and this forces him to take refuge in the city proper. Now, it would have been dangerous being under siege, but the Yellow Turbans did not have very good camp discipline. So Huang Fu Song launched a fire attack on their camp, and this forced them to really loosen the siege so that they could forage enough supplies to stay in the field. Meanwhile, Zhu Jun arrived with reinforcements after he had been defeated earlier. He had recovered and then came to the rescue for Huang Fu Song. One of Zhu Jun's chief lieutenants at the time was Cao Cao. So together, this trio launched a big counterattack and won a huge victory against the Yellow Turbans at Yingxuan. They then pursued south, so to put it on the map, they won here and then swept south to Runan, around this area, probably all the way to the Yangtze River, secured that region. And then Huang Fu Song was sent all the way to the north in order to finish off one of the last garrisons. So, I mentioned earlier that Zhang Liang's army was besieged at Guanzhong. Guanzhong being up here, I think. That says Guangyang, I just noticed that. I might be wrong about what city that is. We'll just pretend I'm right, though. So, Zhangjiao had taken over from Lu Ji, and hadn't done too well. He's now relieved by Huang Fu Song. And Huang Fu Song will be the commander who wins the war. At first, he tries the defenses, and Zhang Liang is still game. A month later, he assaults, captures the city, kills Zhang Liang, captures Zhangjiao's body, and allows some troops under Zhang Bao to escape. Huang Fu Song then sends the severed head of Zhangjiao back to the court, and then sets out in pursuit. He manages, with the help of a local army to the north of the garrison, to corner and then destroy Zhang Bao's survivors, and supposedly he killed so many men that he and the other commander half-jokingly said, "We could construct an observatory." And by observatory, they don't mean something designed to look at the stars. They mean that they're going to stack all the corpses together in order to try to see Luo Yang from where they're at. So pretty grim humor here, but once again it shows you the kind of dehumanization of the Yellow Turbans in the minds of Han officials. After this, Huang Fu Song was promoted
to a higher rank and then sent to govern Ji province, which is in the north. He was very popular as both a general and a governor because he was known for being very considerate of his men's needs and for being non-corrupt and really generous to the men who served him well. One of his friends urged him to use his influence and prestige at court to demand reforms across the empire, but Huang Fu Song thought that would be arrogant and beyond his station, so he kept quiet. And nothing came of that. Later on, in 185, as the rebellion in Liang continued, Huang Fu Song was called out of his governorship and sent west. But he didn't really have much of a chance to make an impact because almost as soon as he was out west, some eunuchs back at court began to smear his name, so he got recalled. And apparently he had inflicted some kind of an insult on one of them by hastily leaving a dinner that he had attended or some dumb shit like that. So Huang Fu Song gets recalled and basically put on trial. At one point, it looks like he's slated to be executed, but his son pleads with the emperor, and the emperor decides not only to pardon Huang Fu Song, but to then restore him as consultant. So Huang Fu Song is back at court, but probably pretty uncomfortable. And we'll see that he becomes much more circumspect from 185 until the end of his life. He won't really express all that many strong sentiments from this point forward because this experience really put the fear of death into him. In 188, the rebellion in Liang is still ongoing. Mostly Zhangjiao had been out there and he had not been doing all that well. So for all of the fame that he attained later, Zhangjiao, I think, consistently showed that he's actually a very bad general. Yet he got chance after chance after chance because he's very well connected. So anyway, Zhangjiao wasn't doing too well, so Huang Fu Song was sent back out west, and he was actually made Zhangjiao's commanding officer. He was given the title General of the Left, and he was given an army at Chang'an. One of the nearby fortifications at Chenkang was under siege by the rebels, and Huang Fu Song decided that the garrison there could hold out against the siege, and that the best tactic would be to let the besiegers wear themselves out, then break the siege and attack while the enemy was trying to retreat and was still tired. Now, Zhangjiao thought this was a terrible idea and vehemently disagreed, but Huang Fu Song overrode his objections. So they fought that battle, and Huang Fu Song managed to win the day, scoring a huge victory. However, not only had Zhangjiao opposed letting the garrison at Chenkang fend for itself, but he also opposed when Huang Fu Song wanted to attack. He said the timing wasn't right, that they needed to wait. Huang Fu Song once again overrode him. So both of these men benefited from the campaign, by the way. Zhangjiao picked up an office. He became governor of Bing, and then Huang Fu Song was to remain as an army commander. But Zhangjiao took all this personally, the fact that his advice had not been followed. So he refused to hand over his men to Huang Fu Song. And rather than use force and his superior prestige within the army to force the issue, Huang Fu Song, who was a stickler for the rules, wrote to court and asked for a formal order. But instead of arresting Zhangjiao or relieving him or really doing something to prove the point, the court basically just sent a weakly worded reprimand to Zhangjiao and allowed him to get away with it. So basically Huang Fu Song then had to go back to court without having fulfilled his duty properly. And by the way, Zhangjiao would continue to rub Huang Fu Song's face in this for years. All of these little slights. But it was a one-way rivalry. It does not appear that Huang Fu Song had any strong personal animus against Zhangjiao. So, once he got back to court, Zhangjiao's supporters at court, who seemed to have been pretty numerous, because Zhangjiao, while he sucked on the battlefield, was very good at political battles, they attacked Huang Fu Song's loyalty, and once again, he was nearly executed, And this is actually the time his son pled for him. I'm sorry, that was not the last time, it was this time. So Huang Fu Song barely avoided execution thanks to his son. He's now restored for a third time as consultant. And later on, when Zhangjiao would take over after the death of Hojin, he would tease Huang Fu Song about his demotion, but Huang Fu took it in good humor and refused to show his true feelings. He survived Zhangjiao, who died at the hands of Lu Bu in 192, and he remained at court for the reign of Li Zhu at Chang'an. So Huang Fu Song would live for 3 more years. He had died in 195. The last few years of his life, after Zhangjiao was out of the picture, the other officers would honor him because they knew that he had been an honorable man and someone who had done very well by the empire. But they didn't really give him much in the way of actual power. He did get some additional titles, but at this point he's also getting older. He's probably in his 60s, and health seems to be a little bit indifferent. And in 195, he passed away. He received a very nice funeral. Most of his peers thought that he was a pretty talented guy, an honorable man, but they said that if he had one fault, it was that he was simply too honorable for the times in which he lived. Meaning that because of his dedication to following the rules and doing what was right, he was not the right man to try to compete with someone like Zhangjiao. So in a way, he's actually inadequate for his times. But at the same time, when he was given authority and allowed to exercise it, he did pretty well. I thought about knocking him down a bit because of how his career ended and because he wasn't very politically savvy. But ultimately, I'm gauging this mostly on military ability, and it's clear from both his time in Liang and his earlier time as the chief field commander against the Yellow Turbans that Huang Fu Song is a very skilled commander. Accordingly, I rate him as an A. I think that anything lower than that would be a little bit unfair. Anything more than that would overestimate the challenge that he faced. But there definitely was a challenge because remember, most of his men weren't that professional, and also a lot of other commanders, including his nemesis Zhangjiao, did manage to fail. So failure was possible. I think an A seems about right for Huang Fu Song. Alright. Next up, we have Lu Ji. Lu Ji is an interesting fellow. He is someone who rose to high office because of qualities that, to us, don't seem to have anything to do with one's ability to command men in the field or to serve as a governor. But based on the way that the Chinese bureaucracy worked, based on the way that merit was determined in their meritocracy, he was seen as someone of immense ability. One common trope in ancient Chinese literature is that whenever someone is heroic, they are portrayed as being extremely tall. And a lot of times the measurements, if you translate into English, will turn out at 8 or 9 feet tall, which is clearly a little bit of an exaggeration beyond what is possible. But Lu Ji is said to have been about 8 feet tall and to have had a very distinctive, ringing, commanding voice. He also was known for being very honorable and maybe a bit too fond of wine. However, you might think, based on all that we're talking about someone who was a career soldier, but in fact, the vast majority of Lu Ji's activities throughout his life were scholarly, especially early on. Early in his career, he was known based on due to his exams as being a man of great ability, and the court kept trying to press him in the service, but he declined, and instead focused on working on scholarly commentaries for classical works. And he produced a number of these, and they were very well regarded. It was only in 175, after he had become very famous as a scholar, that he finally accepted a governorship, and in this capacity actually put down a revolt by non-Chinese. After a year or two in this office, he pled illness. He probably did fall ill after being thrust into action after living a much different lifestyle. But the court had figured out that Lu Ji was a capable man who was good in action, so they decided if there's a future crisis, he will be in our rotation of guys to turn to. After this assignment, he went to Luoyang, where he supervised the completion of a new history which carried the official story of the Han up to the year 168 when Huan came to power. Later on, he served as attendant of the court, and he spoke pretty openly against the prescription that the court passed at the time. And he also spoke strongly against the Emperor Ling's practice of selling offices and commissions. This did not put him in good stead with the court, including the emperor and the eunuchs, but he was not openly punished for this defiance either. He took command of elements of the Northern Army, which was what the official name of the professional force at Luoyang was called, and he invested Zhang Jiao's main army at Guanzhong. So he is the initial commander who goes and faces the main army. He beats them and forces them back into the city, and then as he's beginning to lay siege, he's recalled on some trumped-up charges by his enemies at court. So the eunuchs waited for several years before striking back after he had spoken out at court. And he actually was brought back to court in a cage. And then he was kept in the dungeon awaiting execution. He was only saved when his successor, Huang Fu Song, was able to defeat Zhang Liang's army and then use his new prestige to prevail upon the emperor to pardon Lu Ji. He pointed out that Lu Ji had done nothing wrong and did not deserve that fate, so Lu Ji was spared at the last minute and then returned to the Secretariat so he could do more scholarly work. We don't know what he was up to for the next 5 years, but in 189 he returned to the scene where he's advising Hojin. Hojin was wanting to bring Dongzhuo to the capital in order to offset the influence of the eunuchs, and Lu Ji said, "That is a terrible idea. Dongzhuo is not to be trusted under any circumstances. The man is a snake." Hojin famously ignored that advice, and what would prove to be one of the bigger mistakes of his life, the mistake which would ultimately doom his successors. Apparently, Dongzhuo was aware of Lu Ji's disapproval, and there was quite a bit of tension between the two men once Dong arrived at court and took over. But Lu Ji actually has a period of great activity in 189. So Hojin is dead, Dongzhuo hasn't yet arrived, and as we mentioned, Huang Fu Song is now getting fairly old, and also he's pretty circumspect about his involvement. So when the eunuchs are trying to take advantage of the chaos to seize control of court, the man who steps up to stop them before Yuan Shao kills them was Lu Ji. So the eunuchs tried to assassinate the Dowager Empress, that would be Empress Ho, Ling's former consort. Lu Ji foils this attempt. And then some of the eunuchs also attempt to abscond with the boy Emperor Xiao. But Lu Ji chases them down at the head of a force that he raised. And he returned the boy Emperor unharmed back to the capital. Once Dongzhuo arrives, he proposed to depose Emperor Xiao in favor of his younger brother, Emperor Jian, who was more pliable. And he figured that a younger emperor who owed his position to Dong would be loyal. Well, it was obvious what he was doing, but most of the people at court were too afraid to speak out directly. Now, a whole lot of people were outraged. Famously, Cao Cao attempted to assassinate Dongzhuo, and of course Yuan Shao would organize a coalition against him. But the person who first spoke out against Dongzhuo openly and had the courage to stand up to him face to face was Lu Ji. He said that this was a terrible idea, that it was self-serving, that it was against the interest of the Han. And Dongzhuo nearly had him put to death for his words, but he was dissuaded because one of Dongzhuo's friends happened to be a friend of Lu Ji. That man would be Kai Yong, who had worked with Lu Ji on one of his books several years earlier. A little bit after this, probably in 190 or 191, Lu Ji, who was about 60 years old, decided that he was just about used up, his health was declining, and he detected that the end was coming near. So he decided to retreat to his home area. Dong Zhuo pursued him with men, but the men weren't able to find him because he knew the hills around his home very well. So he was hiding out while waiting for the patrols to leave. After he got home, he was visited by Yuan Shao's recruiters who tried to get him to come and be an advisor to Yuan Shao, but he said he was too old for such things and declined the offer. In 192, shortly after Dong Zhuo was forced to retreat from Luoyang to Chang'an, Lu Ji passed away. Now, Lu Ji was clearly a capable man, someone of considerable ability, but he couldn't really stay in power for too long. He didn't have a good chance to prove himself. Based on what he did do, he does seem to have had some skills. But as things stand, his primary legacy is as a court official and as a scholar, not as a general. I would rate him as a B based on his early performance, but it's a pretty tentative B because we don't know if he would have been able to pull off the operation any better than his successors did. I mean, there's reason to think that he could have, but we simply don't know. And certainly the delay when he was recalled and then Dong Zhuo took over, that also put Dong Zhuo at a disadvantage, to be fair. But, yeah, I think there's plenty of evidence at this point over several years that Dong Zhuo was not a very skilled commander. So, it's probably mostly his fault. So, I noticed I made a mistake here. I forgot to put Zhu Jun's picture. So what I'm going to do is pull up an image of Zhu Jun. Partly this is because earlier I had trouble with my notes where a keystroke eliminated my whole entry on Zhu Jun. So we will have to pull him up. This way. This looks... I think this is maybe the one from 10. I can't tell. One of these. Anyway, Zhu Jun is an officer who was known for being kind of like Huang Fu Song, a man of very high character. And I have to wonder because... Zhu Jun and Huang Fu Song are these men of an older generation, if partly this praise their character was kind of a tacit backhand to the next generation of men who were so self-serving. I don't know, but I suspect that that probably was the case. So Zhu Jun started out as someone who didn't necessarily have the most promising future initially. He was the product of a single-family home. His father died when he was very young, and his mother was a silk seller. Based on the fact that he was well educated, though, I imagine that his mother must have had something of a silk empire. I doubt that she was a simple silk maker. We also know that he was able to use some of his mother's silk in order to help one of his friends. So he had money to spare, and we'll see that a couple times. This is a guy with deep pockets. So just the fact that his mother was in the silk business should not make us think that he is necessarily lower class. And he is someone who not only was known for generosity, but for doing great kindnesses to people who didn't necessarily do anything for him. So at one point, early in his career, he wasn't too junior. He'd have already been in his 30s at least. In 173, he was serving under an official named Yen Duan in Zhucheng, where there was a peasant revolt. Yen Duan was not doing very well handling the revolt, and some other officers wrote a negative report, which probably could have gotten him dismissed from service or killed. So Zhu Jun decided to ride hellbent after the messenger and bribe the guy to amend the message to make what Yen Dewan did look better. Yen Dewan did not put him up to this at all. So Zhu Jun just gave a more truthful account, which still didn't look great, but at least wasn't a total hit piece. And this led to Yen Dewan not being executed, but rather just being convicted to do hard labor for a while and then dismissed. Zhu Jun's conduct was noted, and he was widely admired and respected by his peers. He governed in a place called Donghai. Let me see if I can find that on the map real fast. Yes, right here. So that he governed here, and he was known for being a very good governor. He also served as an inspector in Zhao, and he dealt with a rebellion led by a man named Liang Long. I'm not sure where that was, but this would have been not long before the Yellow Turban Rebellion. So he actually is one of the generals on the imperial side with recent experience, one of the very few. The other one is actually, I think, Zhangjiao. You know, of course, as we've seen, sometimes experience doesn't necessarily make you that great. Usually it does help, though, unless you're Zhangjiao. He also put down, during this revolt against Liang Long, he killed one of the local administrators who had defected to the rebels and dealt with the problem. He was enfeoffed after this victory and promoted. Enfeoffed means that he was made a nobleman, so he became a marquis. The Yellow Turban Rebellion broke out. He became general of the household on the right. And he was, as I mentioned, sort of co-general with Huang Fu Song. They were commanding technically separate armies, but they also cooperated. And Zhu Jun had as his chief subordinate a 30-year-old Cao Cao. He was 29 or 30 at the time, and he would have been his chief subordinate. Cao Cao led the cavalry and did an admirable job. I presume, though, that a lot of what Cao Cao demonstrated later as a commander he might have learned from observing Zhu Jun, because this was someone who had a lot of experience and who was pretty talented in his own right. So we could make the case that Zhu Jun played a big role in the development of Cao Cao. I mean, I don't know how true that was, but I imagine it almost has to be at a certain level. So he was sent against the forces at Wan, where the administrator Chu Gong, who we'll get to later, had been murdered, and his city had fallen. He then managed to retake the city in time. That was one of his more important achievements. Of course, we mentioned earlier he worked with Huang Fu Song for a time. He was promoted again in 185. He led an army against the bandits under a man named Zhang Liang in the Black Mountains. He managed to check them, but not quite put them out of commission. And one of his solutions for the problem was to give Zhang Liang a commission in the army, so that way he would quit his banditry. He now came back to the capital. He was promoted again, and he seems to have stayed at the capital, though. When Zhangjiao came to power, he was now stationed as intendant of Henan. Zhangjiao wanted to make Zhu Jun his chief lieutenant, but Zhu Jun said no. And he also protested the move of the capital to Chang'an after the coalition came against Zhangjiao. I think this might be one of the reasons why men such as Huang Fu Song and Zhu Jun were condemned to obscurity in their later years, is because despite the rebellion against Zhangjiao, neither of these men left court to go and side with the rebels. A lot of it is probably because they felt like these young whippersnappers didn't know what the hell they were doing. Another part of it might be that they thought they could mitigate damage at court. But another part of it, too, is they might have just been getting too old to really get the job done. But at any rate, though, Zhu Jun remained behind at Luoyang after Dong Zhuo initially withdrew. Then Zhu Jun defected to the Eastern warlords and went into the Jing province. Dong Zhuo dispatched a general named Yang Yi to replace him, but Zhu Jun was able to defeat him and hang on to Jing. Liu Yang was abandoned after his defection to the warlords, and he set up his headquarters in eastern Henan. He looked for allies. He got some troops from Taoqian. He also managed, but then he fought against Li Zhu and Guo Si and lost, surprisingly. And actually, I didn't know Zhangjiao was mounting deep offensives in 192, but in 192, Dong Zhuo was reaching Yanchuan and then Shenlu, which would be fairly nearby, so these would both be about in the same region. And here, Zhu Jun was actually defeated by Li Zhu and Guo Si, who later on really embarrassed themselves horribly as the leaders of Chang'an. Later on, he was recalled by the emperor of the Chang'an, and despite his fear of Dong Zhuo and Dong Zhuo's successors, who now were Li Zhu and Guo Si, the two men who had beaten him, he still obeyed and went to the capital. But he only stayed for a year. After there was an eclipse, he said it was a sign from the gods he was supposed to leave office, so he did. And he was apparently nominated to lead an embassy to the east on behalf of Li Zhu. But in 195, things went to hell in Chang'an, where Li Zhu and Guo Si started to fight each other. And so Emperor Xian dispatched Zhu Jun and some other guys to Guo Si to negotiate. But then Guo Si just took the whole party hostage in order to use them as bargaining chips. Zhu Jun, who by this point was an old man, got really pissed off and then died soon afterwards. A pretty sad end to one of the great generals of the end of the Yellow Turban period, the end of the Han period, excuse me. But he probably should not have gone back to the Han court at this point. I mean, Li Zhu was trying to do what Dong Zhuo was doing, using the emperor as a puppet, but just doing a shittier job of it. And there was no reason to be there, unless he wanted to overthrow Li Zhu and take command himself. And just like his friend, or at least colleague, Huang Fu Song, he was around watching these two morons tear the city up when he died as an old man who couldn't do anything about it. So, Zhu Jun, to me, seems a little bit more pedestrian than Huang Fu Song. I don't think he's as talented, certainly. He does have a longer career in terms of his military achievements, at least as a senior commander. I'd rank him as a solid B, but I don't think I can go higher than that. And I'm actually leaning, if anything, a little bit more B minus C plus. He never really faced a true challenge, but he did manage to overcome the enemies he did face. And yes, I'm ranking the Imperials a little more harshly than the Yellow Turbans because they had more resources, better officers, and better equipment. Now we get to Zhu Jin. Z-O-U, Jing. Now, I could not find his official portrait. I assume it is this, though. Or this is as close as I'm going to get. I don't think this is the right one, now that I think about it, but he's a very minor figure, so it doesn't matter too much. We can probably go without him being quite 100% represented. Where did it go? Quick super chat, James McGartland, 199, thank you, sir. Napoleon III, Second French Empire stream ASAP, please. I'll talk to Sean about that. I'm not opposed to it. We'll see what we can do. That's something we might get to this year. I don't know. I know we're pretty much booked for March and most of April already in terms of different plans, but after that we have a fair amount of flexibility. Alright. So, back on track. Let's go back to our official list here. So, Zhu Jin was, at least in the translation I read, he held the rank of colonel. I'm not sure exactly what equivalency that would have, if that would be the equivalent of our idea of a colonel. And the reason that I'm doubtful about that is because one of the other things I've been researching, and something we'll talk about next week, is the Ottoman army of World War One. And in that army, the rank of colonel was very influential, much more so than in the Western armies. So this rank could be far more senior than it seems. I don't know for sure. But he was a colonel in 184, and he was the adjutant to Hojin's northern army. So in the reserve army at the capital, he was sort of the chief of staff equivalent. Maybe somewhere between a chief of staff and an executive officer. And so my assumption is that he handled a lot of the day-to-day operations of the army and made up for Hojin's lack of practical experience as a commander. But again, Hojin did not lead troops in the battle very often, so whatever the faults he might have had were not that big of a deal anyway. He just had to make some strategic decisions. And again, most of the decisions that he made were pretty wise, including replacing Zhangjiao with Huang Fu Song, things like that. But Zhu Jin, the only reason we know about this guy is because in 185, when they were dealing with the Liang Rebellion, he officially recommended that they recruit troops from the Zhanbi people rather than from the Wu Huan, on the grounds that if you're looking for loyal barbarians, they would be a better fit. Let me see if I can find... I assume this is where the Zhanbi are from. And as for the Wu Huan, they'd be from up here. So basically what would later be called Manchuria for both of these factions. So they're on the other side of the Zhong. And of course, Huang Fu Song's family originally came from this group. Just to give you a sense of a little bit of the ethnic diversity in the north. And then in the south, this was still mostly non-Han. And actually, when we get to Eastern Wu, eventually we'll notice that a large percentage of Wu's troops were actually dedicated to holding the interior against non-Chinese. And actually, the general He Qi, who is typically overlooked in the Koei products, was arguably the most important Wu general at any given time, because he was the commander of the interior. So he always had a large army, and it always carried out an important task. But we'll get there at a later time. So, Zhu Jin made that recommendation. And then after this, despite the fact that he had made friends with Hejin, or at least worked with them, Hojin that is, he kind of disappears from history. Now, my theory is that he should have been in a good position to gain greater influence, because the position he occupied was similar to that of Cao Cao or Sun Jian. He was a junior officer who still had access to the top commanders, did reasonably well, offered sound advice, but he just drops off the map. So my suspicion is that either he died an early death, or that Hojin didn't like him, and didn't really push for him while he still had sway, and that might have doomed him. I suspect that if Hojin had been impressed with him, he would have recommended him for a governorship after the Yellow Turban Rebellion, but he didn't. And so it looks like Zhu Jin languished in obscurity and possibly just left service in disgust, I don't know. But he disappears from history, and so he is unrankable. And now moving on from him to someone who... a person who is even less likely to have the right portrait. For this guy, I'm guessing that Koei came up with their own spelling. The work that I read by Rafe de Crespigny, the Biographical Dictionary, which translates a whole lot of the biographical entries from the Record of the Three Kingdoms, says that the next officer has two variants on his name. It's either spelled Chen Ji with a J, or Chen Ji with an X. So either J-I-E or X-I-E. But Koei does not have either of those spellings. However, given that the officers that I saw with similar surnames had weird first names weird personal names I didn't recognize, I figured he might be one of those guys. I chose this portrait at random. Again, when we deal with these more obscure figures, Koei sometimes drops the ball a little bit, and let's face it, even the scholars of this period, even though this is a more biographically focused field than, say, Roman history, even so, a lot of these really minor figures tend to be neglected. So, I'll just assume this is Chen Ji. Close enough. As I said, he was basically the man of 184. So, he first attained fame by answering the imperial call to arms in 184. So in this sense, he's comparable to men who hadn't served in the past, such as Liu Bei. Or, I think Gongsun Zan might have been in that category too. I'll have to look into that. But there were a number of people who had never really served with the government before who rose up with personal armies to join the imperial forces. And Chen Ji was one such man. However, because he had a very short career and because he essentially disappears so early, for reasons we'll get into, we don't know much about his background. So we don't know where he's from, we don't know how old he was, we don't know what kind of family he came from. None of that's known to us. We don't know if he had any connections at court, if he had a famous family name like Liu Bei. We don't really know how he got his start in life. But we do know the way that he made his name, and that was through being a badass in battle. Actually, he is the most accomplished duelist of the Yellow Turban Rebellion period. And had he lived longer, I wonder if we'd remember him in the same breath as, say, Guan Yu and Zhang Fei and Lu Bu and some of those guys. Because that was the kind of officer that he was. He was the kind of guy who was a big, powerful guy who fought and won duels on a regular basis. My suspicion is that the fact that he was able to win promotion for his deeds in battle means that he must be from a well-off family and have had a formal education, but I don't know for certain. Once in a while, someone would be promoted for great deeds. There was some variability with that imperial structure. So his first great deed was to slay Zhang Manchang during the Battle of Zhulu. And the officials who saw this were sufficiently impressed that they decided to reward him with Chu Gong's old title of Prefect of Nanyang. So Chu Gong, who we'll get to a little later, had been slain in action by Zhang Manchang. So as his avenger, Chen Ji was given command of his former area. That's a damn easy way to get a command, by the way, comparatively speaking. Later on, he managed to work his way back to Wan, where, of course, he was now one of the senior commanders. And he managed to kill Han Zhong in the fighting. And that had a major influence on the outcome of the battle, as at that point, Han Zhong was the garrison commander inside of Wan Castle. This both left the inexperienced men we talked about earlier in charge, and also forced Xiaohong to try conclusions with Sun Jian outside the castle, which also resulted in an imperial victory. So he had a pretty major role to play in the fall of Wan, as well he should, since he was now the governor of that area, since he had previously avenged the death of the prior governor. It's interesting, though, that Chen Ji is the kind of guy who should have been a superstar going forward. He achieved about as much as someone like a Sun Jian, or a Cao Cao, or a Liu Bei. Probably more than Liu Bei, if we're being completely honest about it. And he was, initially. He was rewarded with the command at Zhangjia, which is in the Jing province, or maybe it's right next to Jing, but not quite in it. It's right here on the north bank of the Yangtze River. This was a small city. He was here in 185 when there was an army mutiny, and he was killed while trying to get the men to calm down. Again, I think if this guy had lived, he would have become one of the heroes of this period. He had all the markings of a heroic leader. He was incredibly brave, incredibly strong, and he seems to have been an honorable guy so far as we can tell. But unfortunately, his personal bravery did mean putting himself in harm's way, and in the case of dealing with this mutiny, he put himself in harm's way and paid the price for it. So, just like the scenario where Zhang Jiao lives longer, I think another interesting scenario is Chen Ji lives longer. How does that change the outcome of events? Because this guy had the potential to become one of the major players. Who knows? In terms of rating for Chen Ji, I think he's an A. And that's based on a pretty somewhat limited sample size, because of course he wasn't in full command, he was a subordinate officer, but he did as well as he could have, pretty much. If anything, he's the closest thing to an S. Because, I mean, he came from nowhere, made himself a national hero, and was a shooting star in the ranks of the Han, and then he was killed in the mutiny. I can't quite put him as an S, though, because I feel like if he were truly an S-tier commander, he would have figured out a way to get his troops to not kill him during the mutiny. I can't think of any great generals who were killed in the mutiny. No offense, Zhang Fei. Zhang Fei sucks, by the way. Hot take, but he does. We all know it. We'll get there later when we talk about Shu, but we all fucking know Zhang Fei sucks. Okay. Next up we have, pictured here in all of his glory, Chu Gong. I mentioned Chu Gong earlier. He was the prefect of Nanyang. He answered the call to arms early on, but he was one of the major Han officials who was most caught off guard by the rebellion. Zhang Manchon managed to achieve surprise and take Wan Castle. And Chu Gong tried to fight back and resist him, but failed, and that gave the Yellow Turbans command of Wan Castle, which would be one of their major centers, especially in the south. So this was a huge defeat that Chu Gong suffered. I don't look at him as being incompetent, however, because he was taken by surprise, and it does not appear that he had all that much time to get himself organized when the rebels just started coming at him. So it appears that the Yellow Turbans actually did achieve surprise here, and it goes to show that had the Yellow Turbans been a little bit better at keeping secrecy, or had the Han court been even more decrepit, then the Yellow Turban Rebellion could have been a much more serious deal. As it is, the rebellion was largely resolved by the end of 184, with the exception of a few pockets, and then some other revolts that broke out to take advantage of it, like the Liang revolt, for instance. To me, Chu Gong is a U. I can't really rate him on the basis of just dying after being surprise attacked. Doesn't give me much to go on. So, out of respect, I'm not going to rate him on such a limited basis. Got two more to go. Okay. Now we have Wang Yoon. He was a Han official who had quite a bit of sway for a long time. By the 180s, he's an old man, and he seems to have been mostly a court guy, so he's very much an administrator and not much of a soldier. Now, in the Chinese bureaucracy, there actually is not, to the best of my understanding, any formal division between the army and the bureaucracy. Any officer could be assigned to any task. However, some people had certain things they excelled at, and Wang Yoon was quite clearly an administrator. Possibly a scholar too, but mostly an administrator. In 184, he was in prison. I'm not sure exactly when he was originally put in prison, because he had really fallen afoul of the court eunuchs. But Hojin, once he rises to power, uses his influence with his brother-in-law, the emperor, to get Wang Yoon released. He will remain free for the next 5 years or so, and then Zhangjiao will take over the court. And now Wang Yoon will reappear as a major figure in history. And of course, I sort of prefer the fictional version of what Wang Yoon does next, because it just makes for a better story. But he does start to try to organize a secret plot against Zhangjiao. That part is historical, but I prefer the fictional details because they're so much fun. So, he really bemoans the rise of Zhangjiao, and especially once Zhangjiao deposes Xiao for Jian, he decides that it is worth the risk to try to undermine Zhangjiao. So in order to try to organize a plot, Wang Yoon sent out invitations to the other court officials to come to his home to celebrate his birthday. It wasn't his birthday, but apparently nobody noticed that fact, and that kind of gives you some indication that Wang Yoon might have really slipped into the background at this point in his career, as he's getting older and older, and he's not really a name that's on everyone's lips. And everyone was having a great time because Wang Yoon was very wealthy and threw a great party. But then they notice that he's weeping, and they're concerned. They ask him what's the matter. And he said that he did not want to see the Han Dynasty get stamped out by Zhangjiao, and he bewailed the fate of the nation. So this was sort of crying designed to win sympathy and try to make younger men ashamed to see this happen to an older man, and to try to get them to spur to action. But actually most of the court officials too felt helpless, because Zhangjiao had an army and they didn't. So almost everybody there started crying. But then one of the younger men there, Cao, laughed. And he asked if they were trying to drown Zhangjiao in their tears. He said, "Alright, you weak old men, stand back and watch. I will slay the tyrant myself." So Wang Yoon gave him a special sword, the 7-star sword, to do the deed. Cao marched in the court, and Zhangjiao seems to have largely trusted him. So they were having an audience one-on-one, and Cao was getting ready to strike when Zhangjiao's son-in-law, Lu Bu, who's one of those mountains of a man, walked in. Somebody who's known for being unbeatable in personal combat, and Lu Bu's always armed. So Cao decides that he can't both kill Zhangjiao and live. So he notices that Zhangjiao saw him reach in his tunic for a weapon, so he pulls it out and he says, I wanted to offer you this as a gift. This is a really fine sword, Zhangjiao, and you do such a great job for the Han that I feel like you should have this. And Zhangjiao's a little bit confused, but he buys it. Okay, alright. I mean, I am pretty great, so that's true. I'll take the sword. We gotta give you a fitting gift, though. I noticed that your horse looked a little bit gaunt. So, Lu Bu, take Cao to the stables and give him one of our best horses. Because I think that our guy here should ride in style. So, Cao got a horse and said, I'm just going to go give this horse a test drive. But instead of sticking around, he figured Zhangjiao would be smart enough to figure out what really happened. So he got the fuck out of there. And then, of course, went home to Chen Lu, starts a rebellion. You know the story. Those of you who know the Three Kingdoms know the story, at least. Back at court, though, Wang Yoon is now one sword the poorer, and his Cao plan failed. Zhangjiao does start investigating. Somehow, despite the big outpouring at his party, Wang Yoon's name does not come up. So imagine Wang Yoon was just waiting around, waiting to get arrested, and it didn't happen. So, after several months pass, he's been moping around the house, and his stepdaughter notices that he is not acting like himself. So she asked him what's the matter. This, of course, is Diao Chan. And, we know that historically Diao Chan was supposed to have been a very attractive woman. I think in fiction it really gets exaggerated, where she was the great beauty of her generation, kind of the Helen of Troy of that era. She was probably pretty hot, but I don't know if she was some sort of legendary beauty necessarily. So she says, I will do anything to repay the kindness that you showed me by adopting me and taking care of me all these years. He says, okay, I'm going to use you as a honeypot then. Because I know that one of the big weaknesses of Zhangjiao and Lu Bu, his adoptive son, is that these are both men with huge egos and massive appetites. So he uses Diao Chan as a honeypot. His first step is to invite Lu Bu over for dinner. And he basically just tells Lu Bu, I really admire you, I think that you're a great man, and I want to have you over for dinner. And then he makes sure that Lu Bu gets to spend some time alone with Diao Chan to meet her and be charmed by her. So Lu Bu effectively invites her to become his concubine. And basically Wang Yoon is asked about this as the father, and he agrees. So apparently this also implies that Lu Bu did not think that she was quite a good enough marriage match to officially marry. So that might have actually rankled Wang Yoon a bit, because this means that Lu Bu saw him as being lower status than himself. But anyway, Wang Yoon was happy enough to accept, but in the meantime, he had also been talking with Zhangjiao. And he also introduced Zhangjiao to Diao Chan. Zhangjiao was a much older man, and she was pretty age inappropriate for him. I think she was probably in her late teens. Zhangjiao's in his 50s, and he's also pretty fat. In the fiction at least, he's portrayed as being a big, fat guy with a huge gut. The kind of guy who walks in Golden Corral and makes sure that everybody else has to pay more. But anyway, he goes in and he's really into Diao Chan. And before Lu Bu can claim her as his concubine, Zhangjiao has her move into his house. So now, stepfather and son fall out with each other, and this leads to eventually Lu Bu murdering Zhangjiao. And this eventually happens with Wang Yoon pushing Lu Bu to uphold his end of the agreement. He said, hey, you agreed to take my daughter and take care of her, and I know that I fucked up by letting Zhangjiao take her, but you have to make this good. I'm not a warrior, you are. So I need your backing to make this happen, but you can have my daughter if we deal with Zhangjiao. He's betrayed you, he's a dishonorable man, this must be avenged. So they plot, and Wang Yoon manages to convince some armed men to murder Zhangjiao. So, at least he sees them. Lu Bu has to do the honors, though, because no one else had the guts to kill Dong. And then after Lu Bu kills him, he gets out of the way, and two loyal retainers of Zhangjiao who were stationed nearby Chang'an, two men we've met before, Li Zhu and Guo Si, arrive. The two of them then confront Wang Yoon about what happened. What happened to Zhangjiao? Who betrayed him? I betrayed him. He's a tyrant. I killed him. And now, surprisingly, those two decided to avenge their master. They kill Wang Yoon. Another fun note, though, maybe not too fun, but in fiction, of course, Diao Chan becomes Lu Bu's consort and wife until his death in 199. Because, of course, Lu Bu has to flee from the superior forces of Li Zhu in 192 after he kills Zhangjiao. But historically, during the tumult, Diao Chan is also killed along with her father. So Diao Chan actually dies in 192. She does not accompany Lu Bu to the east. So in the Dynasty Warriors games where you break through at Jia P to fight Lu Bu, but you have to fight Diao Chan first, she's not there, historically. So, anyway, that's it for Wang Yoon. To me, if we look at it based on what he could accomplish and what resources he had available, I'd say he overperformed a little bit. He did manage to get rid of Zhangjiao by using a honeypot. I'd say it's worthy of a B. Because a lot of other people tried against Zhangjiao and failed. He also showed some perseverance. His Cao Cao plot failed. He tried again. He somehow evaded detection, despite being very open about what he was trying to do. So So, I mean, I have to respect the balls in this old man and the fact that he did manage to pull this off. And then he just told Li Zhu and Guo Si to their faces, yeah, I did it. Dong Zhuo's dead. I'm the killer. What you gonna do about it? And of course, what they did about it was kill him. But still, credit where credit's due. This guy had some balls. Next up, the last man we'll cover today is Dong Cheng. And now we're talking about one of the very last imperial officials to be truly relevant. And after his death in 200, we'll have 20 more years where the Han do exist in theory, but in practice, they're little more than puppets for Cao Cao. The last official who will have any kind of independence whatsoever will be Dong Cheng. He actually does not have prominence during the Yellow Turban Rebellion. He does have quite a following at court, though. He seems to have been a fairly adept politician. But most of his status owes to being related to the imperial family. So he's not unlike Hojin in that way. His aunt was the Lady Dong, and she was one of Emperor Ling's other women. And she also, Lady Dong, was the mother of Emperor Jian, which means that now Dong Cheng, once again, is in a very similar situation to Hojin after his nephew came to power. So Dong Cheng is invited to court. By now, the emperor is a puppet under Dong Zhuo, but Dong Cheng still officially gets a good amount of money and some titles for his cooperation and for helping his nephew to quote-unquote govern, which is basically just issuing edicts that Dong Zhuo tells him to issue. He does get an appointment officially as General of Cavalry and Chariots at court, which is a fairly senior rank, but of course it means nothing because it is nominal. When Jian is ultimately taken by Cao Cao and installed at Zhuchang, which becomes the new capital, Dong Cheng goes with his nephew or cousin or whatever the relation is, I can't remember. And basically here he meets with Liu Bei. Now at this time Liu Bei, who was a distant cousin of the Han Dynasty, is becoming disgusted with Cao Cao because he sees Cao Cao as another Dong Zhuo. And the two of them, Dong Cheng and Liu Bei, begin to plot against Cao Cao in order to murder him and then restore Jian to power. I presume that the new Council of Regency would include Liu Bei and Dong Cheng. I don't think they were doing this out of noble motives. And in fact, when we get to Liu Bei, we'll see that this idea of him as this pure-hearted guy who's just out to help his cousins is almost complete bullshit. In fact, Liu Bei was a pretty hard-nosed legalist. And he was just as ruthless as Cao Cao and all the rest of these guys. But, again, different story for a different time. So, at this time, under the influence of Dong Cheng, Jian officially issues an edict which calls for the death of Cao Cao. And using this edict, Dong Cheng was able to rally a bunch of court officials, get them armed, and ready to strike at Cao Cao. The other part of the plan was for Liu Bei to lead his small army to Zhuchang and to attack from the outside in order to ride this edict to victory. The problem is that Liu Bei was slow. Liu Bei doesn't reach Zhuchang in time. Cao Cao detects the plot, and Dong Cheng and his confederates are killed in 200. Of course, then Liu Bei and Cao Cao fall out. They have a long conflict, and Cao Cao gets the better of him for many years. Liu Bei will effectively become homeless for a while after this happens. This is what precipitates his retreat to Jing province and ultimately his migration to Shu in the west. This is why he fell out with Cao Cao, is this fairly harebrained scheme to overthrow Cao Cao and restore the rule of Emperor Jian. And by the way, Jian by this point would have been a teenager, so I guess in theory he could have ruled in his own name. But in practice he would have been a puppet for Dong Cheng and Liu Bei. Anyway, if I had to rate Dong Cheng, I would give him an E. I can't quite justify giving him an F, just because he doesn't fuck up quite enough to deserve that. But at the same time, he did clearly fail, and his plot was not super well constructed. It also relied upon Liu Bei defeating Cao Cao, which is not a great plan given that Liu Bei was much less powerful and not nearly as good of a general. And this is before Liu Bei has Zhuge Liang and the other guys around him who actually know what they're doing. So it was not a great plan, but I'll give him a little bit of credit for having the balls to attempt it. Especially against a guy who once tried the same exact thing, and so was on the lookout for such plots. But anyway, those are my 18 rankings of the relevant Three Kingdoms officials, or pre-Three Kingdoms technically, officials from the Yellow Turban Rebellion era. I'm not sure when we'll pick this up again, or what faction we'll pick up with. My suspicion is that we'll move on to the Zhangjiao faction, since of course he will take over the court, and that inaugurates a short era where he basically unites a large number of warlords against him. So I think that's probably what we'll do next, is the Zhangjiao faction. There aren't all that many followers of Zhangjiao. I will include the people who served under him, including people who have greater significance elsewhere, such as Lu Bu and Zhang Liang. I noticed a few of you in the chat were big Zhang Liang fans, and quite a few Cao Cao fans out there too. But yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about those guys at the time when we get to Zhangjiao's faction. But mostly, of course, it will just be the big guys at Zhangjiao's court, such as Li Ru and Li Su and those kind of guys. So, one last super chat for the evening. Mantis42, thank you, sir. $2. He said, I assume he means, is there any chance for an MGM War stream? It's underrated. That, of course, is the Japanese invasion of Korea in the 1590s under the command of Hideyoshi. There's a chance. There's a chance. I don't know when we'd do it. I'm a little rusty on that topic. I have read about it before. I'm not sure if Sean's ever read about it. So that will kind of determine how long that one takes. But yeah, I think that is on our list. So that is something we do plan on covering at some point. It's an interesting topic. Although we might do something a little before that, I don't know, in terms of something a little bit earlier in Chinese history. What does vocated mean? Yeah, I don't know. I can't hear it because no one else is on here. So, all right. So, all right. That's all I have for you this evening, though. Next week, of course, we are doing Ottoman Generals World War One. The week after that, I believe, is that Sean's birthday? Yeah, I believe that's Sean's birthday 2 weeks from now, so he won't be available then. We might do another one of these on that day. And then we're planning on doing a stream on Patrick Claiborne. One of the moderators from Discord will be participating in that. And we have another one scheduled already. I can't remember what it is, though. Probably in April, we'll be doing the British Generals World War One. So we've got those things coming up, and I imagine maybe 2 weeks from now, tentatively, we will do the Zhangjiao faction. So that'll be the plan going forward. Thank you all for showing up tonight. I didn't know how many people I'd get, especially since I streamed last night, and I know this is a bit more of an obscure topic, so I'm really glad that we got over 100 people to show up for this, because I was worried this would be one with only about 50 people in it. So, but anyway, thanks for tolerating this. I know this one was probably the roughest of these. This is one of the few ones I was actually a little nervous for, just because this is one of those I've wanted to do for a really long time, and it is a much tougher topic than most of the things I've done in the past. That's part of why I put it off so long. And I figured that I have to begin with this event. This event, I think, is the most confusing. So I'm glad to have this out of the way. It's a massive relief. And moving forward, I'm sure that this will become quite a bit easier. So, thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm Thersites the Historian, and you guys have a good week. Also, I'm going to have a lot of lectures coming out this week, because I've got to pump out a bunch for some classes I'm working on. So, be on the lookout for some lectures this week, and then, of course, Ottoman Generals of World War I on Sunday. Peace out, everybody.